Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation and honored to be part of this very timely and important gathering. I'd like to start with my own conclusion. Yesterday's Biden Summit for Democracy is, in short, just like a naked emperor circus of the 21st century. The independent journalist, The Saker, he terms this whole show, if Malcolm X was still alive, he would probably say that all the house Negroes have been invited and all the field Negroes have not. According to a new worldwide poll of 53 countries commissioned by Alliance of Democracies, I quote, "The United States is the nation that most threatens democracy worldwide." A well-known, another independent journalist, a pen named The Saker, argues this way: faithfully supporting a single world hegemony of the already dead, but never mind that they can pretend it is still alive, Anglo-Zionist empire, and obediently participate in any anti-Russian, anti-Chinese operations to prevent the latter from creating a multipolar world. The supposedly noble host nation of the so-called Summit for Democracy, the United States of America, always self-identifies itself with and is often presumed a quote-unquote freedom-loving, democratic, and observing human rights nation. However, today's global populations, including many Americans who seem relatively better aware, better conscious of today's geopolitical power relations issues than the past, wouldn't necessarily agree with that unmistakably narcissistic, illusionary, and self-righteous assumptions. Instead, billions of global populations would challenge the US has for centuries disguised its fundamentally imperialistic, arbitrary, never stick to the so-called rules-based order, quote unquote, plutocratic, oligarchic, unilateral, unruly, thus an outwardly appearing democracy or a pseudo-democracy. The people in the world readily argue today, the US is in essence one of the most or the worst authoritarian nations on earth. Biden's Democracy Summit yesterday, like a bad joke or farce, shows how far out of touch with realities the Washington ruling elites are. The Anglo-Zionist empire, many call today, which has been perceived as a forevermore invincible, omnipotent, and omnipresent power, however, must have been thrown into a constant state of, in Korean, 혼비백산, probably translated, frightened or terrified out of one's minds, out of one's sense, or simply frightened to death, scared to death state. The following 3 points might help us to see some of the sure signs or probable reasons why at this very moment, only 3-4 months after the dramatically defeated, demoralized, and humiliated Afghanistan debacle in mid-August, the Anglo-Zionist empire seemed to have desperately tried to do something to save their such utterly disgraced face, but their hastily prepared whole global gambit turns out to be an unimaginably absurd, childish, despicable, foolish, utterly hypocritical, shameless, self-deceptive, self-inflicting game, the game of boomerang. One maximum degree of fear to lose their exclusive, hegemonic, imperialistic dominance over the world for centuries to a newly emerging multipolar world among the uncontrollably hubristic, narcissistic, self-righteous, unipolar Anglo-Zionist empire power elite. The second, the decline of the empire as the Holy Roman of the 21st century by Ryan Cooper, or as the first failed empire of the 21st century by Michael Mann, seems both irreversible and terminal, as the whole world has dramatically witnessed how the world's only superpower frantically fled from, quote unquote, one of the poorest countries in the world, Afghanistan. The naked emperor of the 21st century, Biden, called it the Afghanistan debacle. 3, the terminal illness of predatory disaster capitalism, as the world witnessed the last 2 days of time and money wasting, useless global show, seems another irrefutable testament to its final stage. Today's world seems far better conscious of Anglo-Zionist empire's ceaseless, rampant carnage, plunder, devastation, neoliberal capitalists' uncontrollable greed, and their never-dying imperial ambitions. Billions of today's global population seem ready to send their farewells to the immensely privileged American way of life, quote unquote, and the quote unquote the American way of empire by Thomas Blender. Those good old days are the past. Geneva School of Diplomacy Professor Dr. Alfred de Zayas, who was a former UN independent expert on international order, argues, observers have expressed cautious skepticism precisely because this gathering, Summit for Democracy, takes a binary approach and starts by dividing the world into us and them, excluding billions of human beings and assuming that the good guys can now show the bad guys what democracy is all about. The UN General Assembly reaffirms that while, quote, while democracies share common features, there is no single model of democracy, that it doesn't belong to any country or region. There is no patent on democracy, no one size fits all. Biden should stop provoking the world by imposing sanctions right and left and boycotting the Beijing Olympics. Democracy is much more than periodic elections. Irish independent journalist Finian Cunningham argues this way, quote, the emergence of a multipolar world is anathema to Washington's dictate for unipolar hegemony, or what it cynically calls so-called rules-based order. The ascendant reality of China as an alternative economic power and the shift in the global economy towards Eurasian integration is unbearable for the US zero-sum view of its imperial demands. A summary from yesterday's long Strategic Culture Foundation editorial, I quote some, the United States history of genocide against Native Americans, its decades of illegal foreign wars of aggression and destruction of nations, its relentless subversion of foreign governments, all of this and more are glaring proof that Washington is the center of global criminality. The biggest enemy of the basic democratic rights is the US government, and yet we have this Biden conference declaring support for democracy. Biden's two-day summit for democracy was a farce even before it began last 2 days. Now it has turned out into a vile circus for Cold War hostility that greatly threatens world democracy, human rights and peace, the very antithesis of what the hubristic Americans claim. Ultimately, however, this charade is doomed to fail. The objective reality is of a changing world whereby US capitalist hyper-militarized power is failing amid the emergence of a multipolar international order. That fundamental historic development cannot be countered by fertile machinations. Biden's Summit for Democracy is disgusting in its fraudulence. This is not just about Joe Biden and the Democrats or the Republicans. The entire political class in the United States is bankrupt, morally, politically, and economically. It is about creating tensions, conflict, undermining democracy, and fomenting war. It really shows the absolutely dangerous hubris of Washington. It somehow is deluded in thinking that it is uniquely endowed to host a conference on democracy when in fact, it has no shame about being a ringmaster for conflict and war. It is blatant that the convocation Biden was aimed at self-serving geopolitical power play. The territory of Taiwan was invited as a representative of democracy while China was excluded. Under US law, the one China policy deems Beijing as having sovereignty over Taiwan. So the pointed invitation of Taipei over Beijing is an astounding provocation to China by the United States. Ukraine was invited to attend while Russia was also excluded. Since the US backed the coup in Kiev 2014 against an elected government, Ukraine has become a byword for corruption and the killing of journalists. The farcical invite by Biden is another geopolitical provocation that will embolden the Kiev's neo-Nazi regime to escalate further its hostilities toward Russia. The fact, let me finish this, even invited representatives, so-called the US-backed Venezuelan interim president, the US CIA trained the puppet Juan Guaido to Washington's naked emperor circus shows how out of touch with reality this entire endeavor will be. Let me stop here. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you.